Now, for the first talisman we're going to be reviewing, it is that of the sun in its exaltation sign of Aries, a solar talisman. A note also is that these talismans are going to be ordered chronologically from how I made them. So, this sun talisman was the first that I made in the series of these 7 talismans that I'll be discussing. And let's also briefly talk a little bit about the structure of the case studies. So in each case study, I will be going over the signification of the talisman. I will be going over 6 main points. Number 1 being the signification of the talisman. What is the virtue or result? Picatrix says is supposed to resolve or fruit from the creation of such a talisman. 2, what is the physical form the talisman takes and what materials were used in its construction? 3, what is the celestial image or symbol used to signify that this talisman is worthy of being ensouled by the divine celestial nature? 4, what is the appropriate suffumigation or incense to be burned during the talisman ritual? 5, what is the election or the auspicious time which signifies that a talisman can be made? And 6, what is the ritual prayer used in order to invoke the celestial hierarchies to ensoul the talisman? And unique to this first case study is I have included several excerpts from Picatrix and Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy that I think help contextualize and justify the reasons why the elements of the talisman were included in the first place. Why these 6 to 7 characteristics in each of the talismans? Why are these processes and steps utilized in the creation of an astrological talisman? And you'll see that a lot of them fall back on these principles of natural magic. So why do materials matter? Can't you make a sun talisman out of anything? Not according to Picatrix. And this comes from the Warnock translation of Picatrix. Here is an example. When you wish to make and consecrate a magical image, consider the purpose and shape in which you wish to make the image, as well as the material of which you intend to make and consecrate it. Let the aforesaid thing be in correspondence to one another, and let them reflect the powers and influences of the planet that rule the working. When it is fashioned in this way, the image will be powerful and complete, and its effect will follow and be manifest, and the spirit that has been placed in the magical image will be apparent in its effects. Those who fashion magical images but are ignorant of the foregoing make them badly. So which materials did I choose for my sun talisman? I have a quirk about myself, and that is I particularly enjoy gemstone talismans. I enjoy making gemstone rings, which is the reason why, in the beginning of the presentation, the slide has an image of 7 rings that I made, one for each of the classical planets. And the sun is no exception. During this election, I made, in particular, a number of peridot and garnet cabochon talismans and several rings for myself. And several rings. And we made these rings out of peridot and garnet, set in sterling silver. Now, how does one determine which gemstone to use for each planet? This requires some research, because the names that common gemstones go by today are not always the ones that have been used in antiquity. So thankfully, we have this excellent source called the Book of Minerals, originally written by Albertus Magnus, that discusses the occult nature and the hidden nature of stones, translated with context by Dorothy Wyckoff. And thanks to her, we have a plethora of notes on the historical origins and meanings of the names of various stones and how they have changed throughout time, along with their corresponding occult virtues from the original text by Albertus Magnus. Another important fact about Albertus Magnus is that he was a teacher and mentor to Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, who we have previously discussed was heavily influenced by Picatrix, and most likely Albertus Magnus was as well. The stone chrysolite is otherwise known as peridot or olivine, And it's described as a pale, of bright green color, and in direct sunlight it sparkles like a golden star. And particularly nice, it is said to drive away terrors and melancholy. And then granitus is described as a kind of carbuncle. Carbuncle being another word for ruby. And similarly, it is said that this stone gladdens the heart and dispels sorrow, another beneficial quality. We also see that both of these stones are demarcated as solar stones in Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. So the chrysolite stone is of a light green color, in which, when it is held against the sun, there shines forth a golden star, and this comforts those parts that serve for breathing, and those that may be asthmatic. And it drives away idle imaginations and melancholy fears, and puts away foolishness. And then, what he has to say on granite. So also the stone, which is called the eye of the sun, being of a figure like the apple of the eye, from the middle whereof shines forth a ray, it comforts the brain and strengthens the sight. So the carbuncle, which shines by night, hath a virtue against all airy and vaporous poisons. So we see again, chrysolite is echoed as a solar stone, and the carbuncle, which garnet, is listed as a solar stone by Agrippa. So we have determined the material and aligned it with the traditional sources. Now we are on to the suffumigation. So why does incense matter? Why does it matter what we suffumigate our talisman with? Picatrix says, the air is a body without which other bodies can have very little life, since it is the medium by which bodies or influences or the effects of the planets may be disposed by the will, acting by a mixture of its own air with the air in general. This may be done by suffumigations, which takes the place of the members of the body, and these suffumigations are composed of woods and things and other kinds. By these suffumigations, the spirits of men are moved towards their desires. In this way, magical workings have marvelous and manifest effect. And if we are going to be doing magic, why not have it have a marvelous and manifest effect? So in this passage, Picatrix describes a little bit how suffumigations are mixing together the air of the suffumigations with the natural air. And it's this combination that helps to, so to speak, breathe life into the talisman. There's another excellent moment in Picatrix where they talk about that the burning of the incense essentially carries the prayers to the heavens and describes the nature of reality, which is quite common during this time and in natural magic, of the suffumigation creating a link, creating a chain of being, so to speak, between wherever the magus or the individual performing the ritual is with that of the divine. So it creates this unbreakable chain by the means of the occult virtue in which to ensoul the talisman. And thus, in the same way that materials particularly matter, and certain materials have an occult virtue, so do suffumigations. And Picatrix and Agrippa give us lists of suffumigations and incenses for each and every planet. So for the solar talisman, I used a combination of saffron, lingam aloes, otherwise known as aloes wood, and frankincense. From Agrippa, the incense of the sun is described as being made of saffron, ambergris, musk, lingam aloes, lingam balsam, the fruit of the laurel, cloves, myrrh, and frankincense. And so these are the 3 elements I particularly chose for my working. Saffron is known for its powerful and medicinal qualities. One of the reasons why I chose these particular materials for the suffumigations and incenses follows along this idea that one of the main goals of this talisman had to do with the time in which it was being created, a time where I and the business I was a part of needed to quite strongly present itself as a reliable, powerful, and competent entity within the global marketplace so that we could sustain business. And so I decided to draw on materials that had connotations or virtues with royalty. Saffron is very well known as an expensive herb, as well as its culinary and healing properties. And both aloes wood and frankincense have a long history of being temple incenses and most holy incenses, which I felt aligned with the spirit of my goal. Next, we shall discuss a bit more of the image that was used to engrave onto the talisman, the election, and the ritual itself in the ritual text. And this is coming from Agrippa. So great is the extent, power, and efficacy of the celestial bodies that not only natural things, but also artificial, when they are rightly exposed to those above, do presently suffer by that most potent agent, and obtain a wonderful life, which oftentimes gives them an admirable celestial virtue. So this is saying that the astrological timing of the position of the heavenly spheres of the 7 classical planets influences not just nature, all natural things, but also artificial things that we create. And that these artificial things, when created, can be influenced by these celestial positions. And the knowledge of the meaning and interpretation of these celestial positions is the realm of electional astrology, which oftentimes gives them an admirable celestial virtue, which thing St. Thomas Aquinas, that holy doctor, thus confirmeth in his book De Phyto, when he saith that even garments, buildings, and other artificial work whatsoever do receive a certain qualification from the stars. So the magicians affirm that not only by the mixture and application of natural things, but also in images, seals, rings, glasses, and some other instruments, being opportunely framed under a certain constellation, some celestial illustration may be taken, and some wonderful thing may be received, for the beams of the celestial bodies being animated, living, sensual, and bringing along with them admirable gifts, and a most violent power, do even in a moment, and at the first touch imprint wonderful powers in the images, though their matter be less capable. Yet they bestow more powerful virtues on the images, if they be framed not of any, but of a certain matter, namely whose natural and also special virtue is agreeable with the work, and the figure of the image is like to the celestial. So more completely, Agrippa is hearkening back on what we've already talked about, the importance of the materiality used in the making of the talisman. And that talismans made with materials that best align with these celestial virtues, using specific celestial images that relate to the planet in question we're making the talisman of, under a correct time, create the most potent talismans. And this was the goal. What was the image engraved on these talismans? Why, it was the sun glyph that is seen inside the Latin version of the Picatrix. Chapter 7 of Book 3 in Picatrix, the author says that the sun bestows a good reputation in the mouths of the people, as well as the qualities of a powerful and ethical ruler. And so the request to the celestial hierarchy of the sun was to bestow noble authority, royal clarity, and leadership that inspires loyalty and unlocks potential without fear. I'm not very interested in being a despot or a dictator. Even though the sun is known for having both benefic and malefic qualities, I wanted to do my best to bring out the most beneficial qualities of the sun talisman. The invocation I used during the electional window was that of the Orphic hymn to the sun. Now, in Pico Mirandola's 900 Theses, which is a text made by another Renaissance thinker, there's a statement made that performance of natural magic, the Orphic hymns are most excellent in generating result. And this fact is also readily listed in the book Secrets of Planetary Magic by my teacher, Chris Warnock. And the Orphic hymns for the invocation of the planetary hierarchies have become the de facto first choice, I would say, for those who are entering it from the stream of Western occultism, of the Grimoire revival. I'm not planning to go through and saying all the Orphic hymns, but if you haven't heard them before or read them, I highly encourage you to take a read. It certainly does give a flavor of the planets. Although Picatrix itself has a number of prayers and particularly petitions to the planets, which I have used for other talismans, as well as the specific workings for petitions listed near the end of Picatrix. And this is what some of the resulting talismans look like. Quite humble and straightforward in their appearance, but nevertheless, definitely get the job done, and that is what we're going to take a look at next. But as you can see, slight engraving of the image and the symbols and the glyph of the sun on a garnet cabochon and peridot cabochon, which is a little more challenging to see based off of the translucent nature of peridot itself, but quite beautiful. Now, a little bit about the context of the operator. Who is this talisman for? Who is making it? It was me the whole time. Now, it's debated and discussed how important one needs to consider their natal placement of the planet in question when it comes to using talismans or making talismans of that planet. And because of that, I am choosing to disclose generally some information that many practitioners would consider too sensitive to disclose publicly, as I mentioned a little bit before. But I think it's a very beneficial and useful investigation here. More particularly, because when we look at the wider traditions and breadth of astrological magic across more than just the European Renaissance and the Elamite tradition, and take a peek into Indian and Iranian traditions of what is usually termed Vedic astrology, there become some more nuanced rules of how to determine whether certain things we certainly would call astrological magic should be applied. And one of them has to do with the analysis of the houses that the planet rules in someone's chart, with a consideration of whether the planet rules a benefic or malefic area of life based off of the house it rules in someone's natal chart, not just the essential dignity of the planet. So I've decided to disclose that here. For the sun in particular, it rules benefic houses, both sidereally and tropically. Excellent. And natally, it's peregrine, so it's not very afflicted whatsoever. It's fairly neutral, which is generally considered safe for the practices of astrological magic, like the creation of talismans. Now, another assumption or criteria that is hard for me to ignore is that if we are going to care about the operator and the mage performing it, one's belief system, religious beliefs, religious following, as well as the kinds of magic that they are performing, probably play a role in influencing the result to some degree. What is it? Not entirely sure. But I did want to bring up some of the underlying mundane and magical currents that one could reasonably expect play some role in this magic. Certainly there is so much reference to the beliefs, piety, and attitude towards the divine one should cultivate in the Picatrix in order to even expect a result. So I wanted to bring that up. I haven't been a monotheist or an earnest follower of an Abrahamic religion in quite some time, though I am a baptized Catholic. And particularly at this point, I was very much what I still am, and that is initiated into traditions of Vajrayana Buddhism. And within that framework, I can entertain and understand that we live in a network of seen and unseen beings, of seen and unseen forces, and that a wise person is wise to understand and acknowledge those forces with reverence and piety. Also, this was not my first talisman. This and these series of talismans were made after I had really cut my teeth with my process for how to conduct a ritual, how to engrave a stone, how to make a ring, how to pray to the planets. This was already pretty well thought out. I also had been baking quite thoroughly in whatever one deems themselves to be surrounded by when you are surrounded by 5 of the 7 possible planetary talismans. And as always, the time in one's life and the context in one's life, I believe, matters. I made this talisman nearly 6 years ago to the day at the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, where it turned out I was one of 4 remaining team members at the company I was at, and the business was threatened to fully fold, go out of business, unless we made some drastic changes. And as many practitioners of any kind of magic may know, when your back is up against the wall, you're more willing to parlay with spirits in order to have better autonomy in your circumstances. And our business was given a very definite fork in the road, which was, do we try to rapidly expand in the state of economic uncertainty, or do we contract? What is the right decision? So I decided to make the Sun Talisman at this time. Let us review the election. Now, those who have engaged in the practice of electional astrology, 1,000,000,000% know there's no such thing as a perfect election. I am also someone that came to the art and discipline of astrology, the magic side. So I'm the first one to say that I am definitely not the world's best electional astrologer. Let me be living proof that you don't need to be an excellent electional astrologer in order to find elections that can create pretty meaningful talismans. But I will let everyone watching be the judge of that. But as the one living my life, I can say it's quite good. I am quite pleased with it. So let us look at the clear pros of this election. We have Sun in its exaltation sign. Quite excellent. So the Sun should be giving its highest and most perfected, most refined results. It is the day of the Sun as well as the hour of the Sun. So in terms of our ability to directly connect with the Sun and channel its exaltation energies through a moment of time are the best that we can hope for. The Sun is separating from Saturn. Now this is quite good. Separating aspects will signify that whatever relationship that's being created or results being produced by the relationship of these two planets are in the past. And this is where we start to integrate ideas of planetary relationships, planetary friends and enemies, integrated with the essential dignity of the planets. How strong are they? How capable are they of producing a result? Saturn is in its sign of rulership in Aquarius. It's quite strong. While the Sun in its exaltation of Aries, also quite strong. Though the nature of Saturn and the Sun, they're enemies. So we really don't want our main significator of the election, the Sun, applying to Saturn, applying to the enemy of which there's going to be some conflict. Who could the conflict be with? Saturn is the lord of the 11th house, which can be allies and friends. Strong friends, conflict with strong friends. But because the degrees are separating, this is in the past. Now, there are different sets of electional rules as they pertain to astrological magic. And we even see differences between sets of medieval rules and Renaissance rules. And there are very opinionated individuals on each side of that spectrum, to the point that individuals will see any aspect to a malefic as bad, or in any aspect to a benefic as good. And then there are those that take precedence the aspects themselves. Positive aspects, sextiles and trines, as a positive relationship, while squares and oppositions as negative aspects are always deemed as unfortunate or malefic. I tend to fall in the camp of it's the nature of the planet that is getting aspected. So in general, say that the Sun was applying to Saturn, I would think that is poor, even though it is a trine. Saturn in Aquarius, Picatrix talks about that Saturn, at least for the individual performing the magic, is acting most benefic when they are dignified in their sign of rulership or exaltation. Whether that means they're going to be a friend to the Sun, hard to tell, but the Sun is the significator of the first house and of the ascendant, which not only signifies the talisman, but also the mage and the working itself. So if it was applying via trine instead of separating, I think the fact that it's separating from Saturn, good, we can just ignore it, and we don't have to rope in the malefic nature. But if it was applying, I wouldn't consider it that big of an affliction, or maybe any affliction at all. We also have the moon fast in this election. We always want a fast moon. The moon is the lord of the sublunary realm, which is the world of the four constitutional elements, the four elements of humanity, of everything that happens on Earth. It is in charge of making magic work and making all phenomenal work. So the fact that it is fast, it is able to more quickly manifest results and quickly produce results in the physical world, which is generally what we want in talismans. Cons of this election. Moon's lord is in fall. Generally, we don't want the lord of the moon afflicted. Picatrix says something along the lines of afflictions to the moon or afflictions to the lord of the moons signify something that may begin strong, but then peter out and fail. They aren't as long-lasting. We also have the moon in a Caden house, which isn't ideal. And then finally, some do not like the south node. Some probably do not like the idea of the south node being angular, being in the 10th house. In Western astrology and in the Western tradition, the south node of the tail of the dragon is more commonly discussed as being a reductive force, a decreasing force. It would make malefics less malefic and benefics less benefic. So one interpretation is that it could be reducing the 10th house results, reducing some ability for this talisman maybe to bring about results. I think that could be a fair interpretation. And then finally, this Lord of the Moon is conjunct Malefic. It is conjunct Mars. But this Mars is exalted. Mars certainly gains from the relationship with being conjunct for Jupiter, but Jupiter is not enjoying being conjunct Mars. So by my own previous criteria, in terms of beneficial qualities to the selection, +5, checklist criteria around a -1 or a -2, depending how heavily we want to weigh in on the South Node. So I made these talismans, and let's see what happened, especially in terms of the sun giving good reputation in the mouths of the people. So we actually had decided for the business to go very strong on promotion and not contract. One of the things that I asked further was aid in becoming known and well respected and trusted across the globe. We were an international business at the time, and I very much saw that as a strength. And we were the only one with such a large footprint for our specific domain and software that we were in. And so we ended up launching a podcast, which in retrospect was incredible timing. Everyone was trapped at home across the world, and it was the time for everyone to indulge in their niche interests, which this company certainly had its fair share of. This whole company was essentially founded on a very niche interest. And interviewing everyone with that same niche interest from some of the largest companies in the world who had that interest proved very, very well for the business. We also made the strategic decision, and something I championed very strongly for, was to build a company and a brand that was all about empowering workers, empowering members of the community, empowering the international labor force, making sure that they were paid fairly and on time, which I was shocked about how that generally wasn't their experience, especially working with American companies. And this ties in very well with one of the other attributes of the sun as being a very kind and benefic ruler, especially in its most exalted form, but also in the eyes of our competitors and collaborators and global colleagues. My favorite quote and piece of feedback from this time was asking some people we highly respected and really valued their opinion. It was like, oh, you probably don't even know that we exist. And their response was, it's impossible not to know about your company in this space. You're literally everywhere. And as someone who is in charge of masterminding the whole promotional campaign, community building, and outreach, and empowering that all with some extra talismanic magic, I was very, very happy to hear that. And in this year, despite the state of things, we found ourselves flooded with project leads, partnership requests, and job applications from people who really wanted to grow with us as a company and really stood behind our mission. And we'll get into this final point later. But this here helped compound us to significantly increase business revenue, ultimately 10xing business revenue in 2020. So this was the outcome of my Sun and Aries talisman. Now let us describe my Venus and Taurus talisman, which I refer to as Harmony's Resonance. The materials I chose for my Venus and Taurus talisman was that of lapis lazuli and aquamarine, which we can find again in the Book of Minerals. Lapis lazuli is having an innate quality for remediating bilious diseases and fevers. An aquamarine, frequently described as a kind of beryl or beryllus, as being effective against peril from enemies, against disputes, and giving victory. Agrippa once again cites these stones as being of the nature of Venus. So fumigations that were chosen for this talisman included lingam aloes and saffron, as these are both healing, sweet-smelling, and coveted scents that resonate with the virtues of Venus bestowing one's ability to be well-liked and well-received by others, and promoting vivacious qualities of health. It's also no mystery that Venus is the planet most commonly associated with music and art and beauty. And so one of the particular requests I gave to this talisman was to enchant the world with enlightened speech. Here again, you see my Buddhist inclination show through in my magic, as well as bringing prosperity, free from strain, magnetizing opportunity, and solidifying it into tangible results. I had previously had a poor experience with the Venus talisman, where I had ignited one of the other significations Venus is said to bestow in Picatrix, which is the appearance of wealth, namely spending all your money and opportunities on worthless, expensive items. Instead, I was looking for an easier time to accomplish my goals, to close opportunity, and integrate that with my singing practice. And the image I decided to use for this talisman is the sigil of the planetary intelligence of Venus, as found in Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. Once again, I chose to invoke the spirit and ensoul the talisman alongside the suffumigations with the Orphic hymn of Venus. Venus's chariot is pulled by none other than a flock of doves, which also relates to the effects of this talisman. And here's an image of this and aquamarine stones that I had engraved. As you can see here, the planetary sigil of Venus. And now we can talk a little bit more about the subject. Curiously, Venus rules malefic houses in my chart, considering a sidereal and tropical zodiac. Though natally, its dignity is peregrine, which is considered safe for the creation of astrological talismans. Once again, like all of these talismans, I already was initiated into the tradition of Vajrayana Buddhism and have been thoroughly bathed in the influences of several other talismans beforehand. This election, as you're about to see, was made on the same day of the Sun talisman, just during Venus's appropriate planetary hour, and thus the life circumstances and context was relatively the same. It was at the onset of the pandemic. We were having business trouble, but I was beginning to get quite anxious about my singing and dancing practices of Newar Buddhism, which I had been growing so accustomed to. I had just finished in 2019 learning 9 different Sanskrit songs to perform for the temple's 10th year anniversary, and I was contemplating more thoroughly committing to the dance aspect of the tradition. However, with lockdown and the onset of the pandemic, these dreams and aspirations of mine seemed to fully come to a close. So I was really hoping this talisman could do double duty, so to speak, and see if it could help both my business life, as well as my artistic and spiritual devotion side of my life. Now, before we talk about the results, let us look at the election. In this election, we have Venus in domicile during Venus hour. Venus applies to Jupiter, and Venus, being a benefic on the ascendant, acts to support the moon. The downsides of this election have to do with the angularity of the malefic, Saturn. However, Picatrix does talk about how Saturn in domicile is some of the most benefic we ever get Saturn. So I'm personally less inclined to see it as an issue. The moon is, however, slow, though Picatrix says this aspect of the moon's afflictions should be remedied by the fact we have a benefic on the ascendant. However, the moon is slow, and once again the moon's lord is in fall. But these should be mitigated somewhat by the fact that we have a benefic on the ascendant. And this strengthened benefic on the ascendant is also the purpose and main significator of the talisman. Venus herself is applying benefic Jupiter. Although Jupiter is in fall, it should still be trying to confer its benefic qualities to the best of its ability. And Venus applies to Mars, which is an affliction. Though this is Mars exalted, and a trine is a benefic aspect. So one does have to question, how malefic or negative can this relationship between Venus and Mars truly be? If one is going to have to get Venus and Mars problems in their life, maybe problems with an exalted Mars could prove to be more beneficial or rewarding in one's life than that of a debilitated Mars. Nevertheless, I went forward with creating the talisman. Again, this talisman was also made around the same time as the Sun and Aries talisman. So one gets to ask the question, how do we tell the difference between the two effects? Particularly, Picatrix does talk about how Venus sustains people so they feel no anger, fear, or strife, as well as areas related to aesthetics, music, and self-expression. Knowing this, I had felt confident in recommending a full company rebrand design and podcast auditory-based marketing push in order to sustain the company during the pandemic. Also during this time, my guru of Newar Buddhism, and Charya singing, and Charya dancing, decided to offer global online classes. And so I was able to fulfill both my business goals and my artistic and spiritual goals. This was also the time I opened up my first storefront for selling astrological talismans, stellartalismans.com. The podcast, the rebrand, and Stellar Talismans were received well by their respective communities. And my guru's choice to offer globally accessible teachings, his rare and beautiful tradition of Buddhist dance and singing as a spiritual practice, was met with tremendous love and joy and celebration, both from his longtime students as well as a whole breadth of individuals who are looking to begin and learn more about this practice. I got to see firsthand how the love, support, and joy in the face of global uncertainty had the power to transform quite a terrible circumstance into an opportunity for learning, an opportunity for growth, and an opportunity to love oneself and their global community, which seems to be highly aligned with the goals and qualities of Venus, as discussed in Picatrix. Now let us move on to discuss my Mars and Aries talisman, which I have deemed the Indomitable. Now I settled on 2 different stones for my Mars and Aries talismans. One of that being garnet, which we have already described. As can you ever have too many tools that gladden the heart and dispel sorrow? I don't think so. But for my particular situation, I was very interested in making a Mars and Aries talisman out of amethyst. Not because it counters drunkenness, which I'm sure is good enough a reason for many people, and though it could potentially keep me up at night, I found myself in a situation where receiving a good understanding of what is knowable was exactly what I needed to optimize for. In Agrippa's section on Mars, we see that amongst the stones, the diamond, lodestone, bloodstone, jasper, as well as that of amethyst are of Mars. And in Picatrix itself, it says that all stones that are red and tawny or speckled are also that of Mars, firmly solidifying both amethyst and garnet as excellent choices for Mars talismans. And once again, our good friend lingam aloes was used as a suffumigation agent. To Mars, all odoriferous woods, as sanders, cypress, lingam balsam, and lingam aloes, Agrippa mentions, as martial incense. So often in mythology, it's more common to associate Mars with the warrior, the one who goes out and fights and performs the destruction of battle. But there is also the Mars the general, the strategist and the tactician that sits at the king's court and knows how to plan and extricate resources efficiently and appropriately, and task others to do so in his stead. It is this aspect of Mars, Mars of the royal court, Mars that has the power of armies behind him, but doesn't himself have to venture into the battlefield, I was looking to bring out through the use of lingam aloes as the sole incense. I utilized the planetary intelligence sigil of Mars, as found in Agrippa, as the celestial image for the talisman, and I had particularly requested to the spirit victory in all pursuits, and the energy and vigor to see success in all endeavors. Once again, I utilized the Orphic hymn of Mars in order to summon the celestial hierarchies and ensoul the talisman. And here is an image of some of the remaining cabochon stones I had made during the selection. As you can see, there's a mix of amethyst and garnet cabochons that were ensouled during the selection. Now let us review the election. Here we have Mars in domicile in Aries, with Mars on the midheaven, which we could argue is Picatrix's preferred position of Mars, as there are some direct prohibitions against ever having Mars in the ascendant. This creates quite an interesting challenge for us who want to make a Mars talisman, particularly when we know we can put the main significator on the ascendant. Maybe Picatrix is trying to advise us against living a life where we constantly find ourselves and the nature of what we're doing fighting all the time. And if that's the case, what good wisdom? So I was quite excited and pleased to find the selection with Mars on the midheaven. In the selection, Mars makes a trine with the moon. Applying aspects between the significator of the talisman and the moon are always preferred, as this signifies speed in the actualization of the effects of the talisman and long-lasting effects of the talisman. This, combined with the fact that the moon is moving quickly, further supports the idea that the effects of this talisman will be quick to fruit. Next, we look at the Lord of the Moon. The Lord of the Moon is Sun in the sign of Cancer. With the Sun in Cancer and the Moon in Leo, it creates a mutual reception between the two, an instance where the Sun and the Moon exchange in each other's signs of rulership. As the Sun finds its home in Leo, and the Moon finds its home in Cancer, and because they're sharing each other's houses, it's almost like these planets simultaneously are in both signs at once. Now, our texts on astrological magic, and especially Picatrix, don't particularly mention an interpretation around what happens when one of these key linchpin significators of an election participate in a mutual reception. But if it does result in this simultaneous sharing effect between the Sun and Moon, in this case, I would argue, It's only beneficial for the talisman. Then we would have the Ascendant Lord receiving some of the resources it would as if it was in its own sign, which is positive according to Picatrix. And we would have the Moon, dignified in its sign of Cancer. And a strong moon is certainly a benefit according to Picatrix as well. However, yes, this would put the moon as having some qualities of being in a cadent house, the 12th specifically. And as you can see, the art of determining and reasoning out a proper talismanic election is challenging. A more clear and definite affliction of this talisman is that of Saturn on the descendant. Planets conjoined the descendant can signify enemies or obstacles or problems that continue to show up in opposition to the nature of the talisman. And although Saturn is dignified in Capricorn, which Picatrix says magnifies Saturn's malefic nature. In a situation like this, the practitioner really does have to ask themselves, how confident do they feel in being able to overcome whatever obstacle is being created? Does the individual feel confident to be able to overcome whatever is signified by retrograde Saturn on the descendant? And thus, depending on one's individual risk tolerance, this criteria in and of itself is enough to pass on such an election. And even though, by my own criteria, there are a number of positives that outweigh the negative, one could easily argue the weight of the negative qualities should deem that one passes on this. However, there's another interesting aspect of this election, and that is the idea that the moon is the enemy of the first house and the enemy of the ascendant, simply because the moon is ever-changing and ever-moving through its phase. And so it creates a lack of stability. So we have an individual and an idea moving on shifting sands, the promise of a potential enemy or threat, stubborn and stuck in their ways, and Mars, dignified and rising, showing us a path to success if we have what it takes to shine and make decisive action. And because of the situation I found myself in, I figured this was more than worth creating. Now, considering my natal chart, Mars is actually an extreme ally and looks to support me however it can. Though tropically, it rules a mix of benefic and dark houses. And dignity-wise, it is afflicted, which is a significant red flag for practitioners of astrological magic. Generally, one is not trying to augment the Aries of life, which causes suffering or problems, even more so when we are dealing with a planet with a malefic nature. The company I was in found itself in one of the worst situations that could have imagined. We discovered the contract we had with our major client wasn't even owned by the individual we thought. We were, in fact, subcontractors 2 layers down, responsible for doing all of the work. The client had stopped paying, and the actual companies holding the contract wanted nothing to do with the work anymore. But we were still showing up every day, doing the work, and not getting paid, because the business agreement was stuck in international legal limbo. I don't recommend this at all. So we needed to quickly figure out a way to upskill our knowledge of international business law and negotiation skills in the wake of the global COVID-19 pandemic. All things that are theoretically possible that someone would know how to do, but we ourselves had no clue and no idea what to do at all. Thus, the stone of amethyst, which bestows the ability of knowing the things that are knowable, seemed like just the solution we needed. And as someone who had previously made talismans that they needed to dispose of, I felt quite confident in being able to shoulder whatever risk was necessary in order for us to get over this hump. And so after making this talisman, I had then petitioned the spirit to find an ally that would make it possible to overcome our approaching adversaries, the individuals who owned the contract, as well as those needing to negotiate with us on the terms of our own agreement. And this was key. I also asked Mars, Lord of War, to see if we could do this peacefully. Within the same week, we had received a recommendation of someone well-versed in international business law and walked us through point by point of everything that we needed to consider for this agreement for free. When we entered into the negotiation rooms with the original holders of the contract, although they had tremendous amounts of money and their own on-staff legal teams to support them, they actually showed no interest. They weren't interested in maintaining any relationship with the client that we were interested in at all. And they gave us their full blessing to go direct with this major Canadian client. With our newfound lawyer, we were able to get a contract drafted promptly And once this contract was finished and sent over to the organization, they had very little to suggest that we changed in order to meet their needs. When all things were said and done, we had secured 90% of our yearly expected revenue for 1.5 years into the future, which consisted of work that was done at a 60% gross margin, securing full-time work for everyone, and represents one of the largest wins I've ever had in my career and really expect to have again. Picatrix states that Mars rules over legal battles, litigation, as well as disputes between people. And I think this talisman provides an excellent description how Mars, when properly approached, can give favor over the obstacles they are most known for creating. I think it's also important to note that we did end up seeing the enemies or obstacles as signified by the retrograde Saturn conjunct Jupiter. Though the result was still exceedingly positive, it does beg the question, what was this obstacle? What was or is this obstacle of the retrograde Saturn conjunct Jupiter on the descendant? It's no mystery that many astrologers who are predicting around this time or conducting analyses would see this aspect of the great conjunction between Saturn and Jupiter as signifying the COVID-19 pandemic. And if there was a looming enemy larger than anyone else that we had talked to, then yes, the ultimate enemy was COVID-19, which caused this whole fiasco in the first place. And we thankfully were given the right knowledge and the right tools with the help of the Mars and Aries talisman in order to properly navigate the battlefield. This is one interpretation. Another interpretation is that Saturn and Jupiter, conjunct in the sign of Capricorn, could represent the long-standing enterprise business incumbents that originally had the enterprise contract we were hoping to take over. I think this is also a fair interpretation. Regardless, circumstances unfolded so beneficially I deemed to keep the talismans, as I found no need to destroy them, and I still have them to this day.